From the moment they left, life became something I never expected to navigate alone. I was still too young to understand what abandonment truly meant, but old enough to feel the depth of the silence that followed. There were no dramatic goodbyes, no explanations, just the sudden disappearance of the two people I believed would always be there. And when the house got quiet, I realized that childhood had ended before I was ready for it. I learned early that independence is not always a choice. Sometimes it is a survival response. While other kids ran home to parents waiting to help with homework or listen to stories from the day, I learned to figure things out on my own. I learned that dinner is something you make when no one else will, that tears are something you wipe yourself, and that strength is often built in the moments when no one is watching. People often say time heals, but time also hardens. In those early years, I thought the loneliness would break me, but instead, it taught me how to carry my own weight. I discovered that relying on others is a luxury not everyone is given. I learned to get up, get ready, and show up, even when it felt like the world had forgotten I existed. And while I never said it out loud, every achievement had a shadow behind it. Every accomplishment held the unspoken question, why weren't they here to see it? I watched other families with a strange mix of admiration and confusion. I didn't envy their gifts or vacations. I envied the simplicity of someone asking, "How was your day?" I envied the presence that I didn't have. And when the world taught me that love was something parents were supposed to give effortlessly, I wondered what I had done wrong to be left without it. The mind of a child rarely sees abandonment as circumstance. It often sees it as deficiency. And for years, I carried that silent burden. But life does something to you when you have no emotional safety net. You learn to become your own anchor. I made decisions alone, celebrated alone, and faced failures alone. I developed instincts and resilience most children never have to acquire so young. I became the person who held myself together because I had no choice but to be both the child and the adult in my own story. And yet, even in the growth, there was a part of me that held on to a small, fragile hope. Maybe one day the door would open and they would walk in with apologies, explanations, or even just the simple acknowledgement that I mattered. As the years passed, I learned not to expect it, but I never fully erased the possibility. That sliver of hope stayed quietly in the corner of my heart, untouched, waiting for the day life might prove me wrong. Little did I know how unprepared I truly was for the moment they finally returned. I remember the day they returned with a clarity so sharp it still stings when I think about it. It was an ordinary day, the kind that begins with routines and expectations and ends with the familiar comfort of predictability. I wasn't waiting for anything, certainly not them. After 12 years, you don't stand at the door listening for footsteps. You don't hold your breath for a knock. You learn to live as though the past has sealed itself behind a door that will never open again. But life has its own timing, and sometimes the things you stopped waiting for arrive without warning. I opened the door thinking it was just another afternoon, and instead stood face to face with ghosts that had suddenly become real again. In that moment, time did something strange. It didn't move forward or backward. It froze. Their eyes, their expressions, even the way they stood, it all hit me at once. I was no longer the strong, self-built version of myself that the world saw. I was the abandoned child they had left behind. My voice, my strength, my rehearsed composure, all of it felt small against the sight of the people who had disappeared without explanation. And the world around us kept moving as if nothing monumental was happening. Cars drove by, birds sang, the wind brushed against my shoulders, but inside me, a storm I had spent years quieting broke loose all over again. There was no script for how to react. I didn't know whether to reach out or step back. Do you hug the people who left you? Do you smile through the pain? Do you ask them where they've been? Or why it took them so long? Or how they could have watched 12 years pass without checking to see if you were still standing? The questions rose in my chest, but none of them made it to my lips. I simply looked at them, searching their faces for the answers I needed, but didn't know how to ask for. A part of me wanted to believe this was going to be the moment everything made sense. Maybe they had a good reason. Maybe life had forced their hand. Maybe they had fought to come back. Hope, even after years of silence, is a stubborn thing. It doesn't die easily. And that fragile hope flickered inside me, telling me perhaps this would be the day I finally received a missing piece of my story. Yet, beneath that hope was something heavier: fear. Because when people who have abandoned you return, it's not just their presence that scares you. It's the possibility that they could hurt you again. I stood there, realizing I wasn't just facing them, I was facing 12 years of unanswered emotions. I wondered if I was strong enough for whatever came next. I wondered if I was still that child who could be shattered with one sentence. And in that pause, in that breath between their arrival and their first words, I understood that the wound I thought had healed was still alive beneath the surface, waiting to see whether this moment would finally close it or tear it open again. When they finally spoke, I think a small part of me was still holding on to a miracle. I wasn't expecting perfection, but I was hoping for something human, an "I'm sorry," or "we missed you," or at least the softness of recognition. I thought that after 12 years of silence, the first words would carry the weight of understanding, maybe even remorse. But instead, their voices came out sharp, practical, almost cold, skipping past the emotion of the moment as if nothing had happened, as if we had spoken only yesterday. Their first words weren't about me, or about the years I spent stitching myself back together. Their first words were questions, judgments, comments about my life, my choices, my surroundings, as if they had every right in the world to critique what they had never been present to build. It was like someone had dropped ice directly into my chest. I had imagined 1,000 possibilities for that moment over the years, but not this one. I wasn't ready for them to speak as though they hadn't missed anything. I wasn't ready for the absence of acknowledgement. They didn't ask how I had survived, who helped me, who wiped my tears, who stood by me. They didn't ask about the nights I stayed awake wondering what I had done wrong, or the days I convinced myself I didn't need parents at all. They didn't ask about the battles or the victories. They just arrived, opened their mouths, and with the first few sentences, 12 years of growth felt small again. It's strange how a single moment can reach inside you and pull back emotions you thought you had left behind. Their tone, their expressions, their assumptions, everything reminded me of the child who once waited for their return, believing that something must have been wrong with her. I wasn't a child anymore, but their words had a way of shrinking me back to that age, to the version of myself that had felt powerless and unseen. It wasn't the words themselves that hurt the most, it was what they represented. It was the confirmation that they hadn't returned because they finally understood the pain they caused. They had come back on their own terms, in their own time, without a trace of awareness of the emotional earthquake their absence had created. I stood there, trying to hold myself steady, trying not to let the disappointment show. The rational side of me knew I shouldn't expect them to be the people I needed them to be. But expectations aren't always logical. Sometimes they are the invisible threads we carry from childhood, the hope that maybe, just maybe, the people who broke us might return with the tools to help us heal. Their first words didn't bring healing. They brought reality. They showed me exactly where we stood, and perhaps more importantly, where we never stood at all. And with that realization, I knew this reunion was not going to be the ending I once dreamed of, but the beginning of a truth I could no longer avoid. The strangest thing about pain is that it doesn't always show up when it happens. Sometimes it waits. It waits for the moment when you think you've healed, when you believe you've outgrown the hurt, when you feel strong enough to look back without breaking. And then one sentence, one expression, one unexpected moment pulls the thread, and everything you packed away so carefully comes flooding back with a force you couldn't prepare for. Standing there in front of them, listening to their words that held neither softness nor acknowledgement, something inside me cracked open. I felt the emotions swell so quickly they almost knocked the breath out of me. I wasn't reacting to their present words as much as I was reacting to 12 years of silence echoing behind them. It's incredible how the body remembers what the mind tries to forget. My throat tightened, my palms grew cold, and the world around me blurred as if emotion itself was fogging the air. I could hear them talking, but the words felt distant, muffled, like I was underwater. Inside, I was a child again, confused, disappointed, desperately trying not to show how deeply the moment was affecting me. Growing up alone had taught me to keep my emotions private, to cry behind closed doors, to never let the world see the fractures. But in that instant, they were all visible to me, if not to them. The memories that I thought I had outgrown returned in flashes. The empty dinner table, the mornings where I walked to school alone, the nights I stared at the ceiling wondering if they ever thought of me, the birthdays where I bought my own cake because there was no one else to do it, all the things I never allowed myself to fully feel rushed forward in one tidal wave. I had built walls, strong ones, but their return had found the cracks in them, and for the first time in a long time, I realized how much of my strength had been built from necessity rather than choice. There was a voice in my head telling me to stay calm, to stay collected, to show them that I wasn't the fragile child they left behind. And on the outside, maybe that's what I managed. But inside, I was shaking. I wanted to ask them why. I wanted to demand answers. I wanted to release 12 years of questions that had lived inside my chest without any place to go. Yet I also knew that if I spoke in that moment, the words might come out as tears instead of sentences, and I wasn't willing to give them the power to see me crumble. People think breaking down means falling apart physically. But sometimes the breakdown happens silently. Sometimes the heart collapses inward, and no one sees it but you. That day, I held everything in not because I didn't feel it, but because the little strength I had left was spent on standing upright. And while I kept myself composed on the outside, I knew that nothing about this moment was simple. The past hadn't stayed behind me like I thought. It had just been waiting for the right moment to appear, and now that moment had arrived. For a long moment, I stood there with everything I wanted to say burning in my chest. I had spent years imagining what I would tell them if they ever came back, how I would explain the nights I cried alone, the milestones they missed, the pieces of myself I had to assemble without their guidance. But when the moment finally arrived, the weight of emotion made the words difficult to access. I realized that this wasn't just about confronting them. It was about confronting a version of myself I had learned to silence. The child who never spoke up, who swallowed disappointment, who kept the pain neatly hidden because there was no one to receive it, that child was still inside me, waiting to understand whether she mattered enough to finally speak. I took a breath, not to stabilize myself, but to choose myself. For years, I had learned to be careful with my voice, to avoid conflict, to stay composed, but this moment demanded honesty. Not anger, not revenge, just truth. Truth without filters, without shrinking, without adjusting myself to be easier for them to digest. I realized I wasn't the one who needed to be careful here. I had already lived the cost of silence. Speaking the truth was the one thing I had never given myself permission to do in their presence, and now I knew I had to. Not just for closure, but for the dignity of every year I had survived alone. I started slowly. My voice wasn't loud, but it was steady. I told them how hard it had been growing up without them, how abandonment isn't something children understand, it's something they internalize. I explained how every accomplishment came with a shadow, how every moment of happiness was accompanied by the question of why I wasn't good enough to stay for. I told them I blamed myself for years, thinking something had been wrong with me. And as the words came out, I felt pieces of myself fall into place, not because they were hearing me, but because I was finally hearing myself. I didn't shout. I didn't accuse. I spoke like someone who had learned through experience, like someone who had earned wisdom through scars rather than books. I told them I had built a life without them, not a perfect life, but a life built with resilience, with intention, with grit. A life I learned to carry alone, even when it felt too heavy. I told them that their return didn't erase the past, and their words didn't go unnoticed. I wasn't asking for apologies. I wasn't asking for explanations. I was simply giving voice to the story that had gone unspoken for too long. And as I spoke, I realized something profound. This wasn't about making them understand. It was about making myself free. I wasn't seeking validation from them. I was reclaiming ownership of my own narrative. The power didn't come from their reaction. It came from the fact that I finally said what should have been said years ago. And in that moment, I felt the shift. I wasn't the abandoned child anymore. I was the person who took the truth that once broke me and turned it into the strength that rebuilt me. When the words were finally out and the silence settled, I realized that this moment wasn't just about them. It was about the person I had become in their absence. For so long, I believed the greatest victory would be having them understand what I went through, having them see the pain, the struggle, the loneliness that shaped me. But as I stood there, something shifted. I understood that whether they understood or not didn't determine my healing. My growth wasn't dependent on their apology or their recognition. My growth had already happened in the years I spent learning how to live, how to rise, how to move forward without the support I should have had, and that sense of realization brought a calm I didn't expect. I looked at them, and for the first time, didn't feel the need to hold on to hope that they would become the parents I wanted them to be. I could finally accept that they were who they were, and I was who I had become. Life doesn't always return what it takes. Sometimes it returns something that forces you to see yourself with greater clarity. Their arrival didn't give me closure. Speaking my truth did. Their presence didn't heal the past. Acknowledging the hurt and standing firm in my strength did. I understood that I had a choice in that moment to carry bitterness or to carry clarity. I chose clarity. Forgiveness didn't mean pretending the hurt hadn't happened. It didn't mean welcoming them back with open arms or letting them rewrite the story. Forgiveness, for me, meant refusing to let their choices continue to shape how I saw myself. It meant letting go of the need to prove anything. It meant recognizing that the person I became didn't grow in spite of their absence, but because I faced the darkness and built myself anyway. And that realization made me stand a little taller, breathe a little deeper, and see myself with a pride I hadn't fully claimed before. I didn't know what role they would or wouldn't play in my life after that moment. I didn't know if they would change, if they would reflect, if they would realize the gravity of what those years had cost. But I knew that my life was already moving forward, and I wasn't going to pause it again, not for their approval, not for their acceptance, not for unfinished stories that had taken enough of my heart. I had earned the right to protect my peace, to set boundaries, to choose what version of myself I wanted to carry into tomorrow. And that is the moment when I truly stepped into a new chapter, not defined by abandonment, but defined by strength. Not shaped by silence, but shaped by the voice I finally allowed myself to use. Not guided by their return, but guided by the person I became in their absence. I was no longer living from the pain they caused, but from the strength I had built. And that is what allowed me to walk forward not with resentment, but with power.